Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the tax scandal surrounding Robert F. Smith, chair of the board of Carnegie Hall. Then we'll review the new film, Louis van Beethoven, now streaming on Amazon. And finally, we'll have an interview with San Francisco Symphony horn player and COVID researcher Mark Almond. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So Will, what do you have today?
This week we have a special prelude segment because it features one of our listeners. With us today is Ted Fishman from Chicago, Illinois. Ted was randomly selected from the pool of our listeners who posted about their love of the Gabfest on social media. Ted, we're so happy to have you here today, and in fact, you have chosen our game. So why don't you tell everyone what we're going to be playing today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, classical chronology.
Okay, here is how this works. I'm going to play clips from 3 pieces from different points in music history that share a common feature. My co-hosts and Ted do not know what any of the pieces are, but it is going to be their job to put these pieces in chronological order just by listening to them. This week, the 3 pieces are all French art songs, and as a matter of fact, though they are composed by classical composers, they could be said to be cabaret songs.
Mad.
You guys ready? How you feeling about this?
This is going to be terrible.
Yeah, this is going to be awful.
Ted, help us. Ted, help.
It's up to you.
I'm putting on my beret and a pencil mustache.
Oh, perfect. All right, well, hit us.
All right, here we go. Here is excerpt numéro 1. And here is excerpt 2. And here's excerpt number 3.
All right, let me get a hat. Put 3 pieces of paper in, labeled 1,
throw it
2,
up in the
and
air,
3,
and then cough it all up.
Just, yeah, right? I mean, how are we... All right, Ted, what are you thinking right now? Because I'm going to need your help for this.
I am thinking in order earliest to latest, 3, 1, 2.
And tell us your reasoning on that. What sorts of things did you hear in these pieces, would you say?
The first one sounded a little English music hall-y. So I was trying to think, like, where would that be borrowed from? What era? Maybe early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And the second one sounded a little jazzy, had like a little kind of Porgy and Bessy kind of thing going on. And then the third one sounded more like Le Hair or something like that. It sounded a little earlier.
Well, when you say cabaret songs, for me, that genre by itself, almost not knowing much about informal vocal music other than like the height of art song, which was Lieder in the German Romantic era, right? I'm almost thinking that we're limited to the first half of the 20th century anyway. So I don't know of art songs or cabaret songs, especially that happened like prior to the turn of the 20th century-ish. So that's just my knowledge, which is limiting me at the moment. With regards to like the musical associations, I hear a little bit of Ravel in the first one. I hear quite a lot of what Ted was mentioning in the second with what feels to me like early modern musicals. That all feels very like proto-Broadway to me. And then the third one, I'm not sure how to place. I agree that it could be from earlier than the first excerpt, just because of the harmonic language, but like the casual style of it, which of course is endemic to the genre that you name, it feels more, I don't know, it has a little bit of a 20th century vibe to it. So I'm not sure how to place the last one. I'm happy to go with Ted in that.
So Ted, you thought the third one was the earliest.
Earliest, yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think it was kind of the most straightforward harmonic.
It's a hard thing, though, because a lot of cabaret is nostalgic.
And it doesn't follow what we think of as a sort of 20th century arc of the later it is, the more angular / dissonant / whatever. Like that does not apply here, especially in less concert hall forms. Like that just did not happen. In fact, arguably the opposite.
Cabaret is tricky because cabaret has a lot of genre songs. It's sometimes backward looking.
Yeah.
They're novelty songs, and Will White is tricky.
I mean, I think we are all united in that we think that 2 is probably the latest. Is that what I'm hearing from Kensho?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and then as to which one is 3 and 1, like I would be happy kind of bandwagoning onto Ted's analysis here, because the third one was the one I had the most trouble sort of feeling like a specific era associated, and not knowing Lehar particularly well. Yeah. All right, shall we lock in Ted's chronology?
I'm all on the Ted.
See, Ted, you saved us here today.
No.
You saved us by having us not having a random answer. Whether it's right or not is almost immaterial at this point.
Well, that's right, and that's how we feel about all of these games.
Right.
Remind me what your final answer is?
In order from earliest to latest, it's 3, 1, 2.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to say you're not correct about this, guys. The actual order was 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
So the first piece was by Eric Satie. It's called La Diva de l'Empire, and it comes from 1902. So your reasoning was excellent all around. You know, when you heard that little bit of English concert hall kind of thing, that's exactly right. And you might have heard little bits of English interspersed in the French lyrics of that song. Number 2 was by Kurt Weill.
That actually is who I had come to mind immediately. I was thinking Mahagoni immediately.
And that's you know, and that's why I chose that one, was because it has that little bit of a tango flair to it.
Yeah.
And the name of the song is Je ne t'aime pas, I do not love you. And that one comes from 1934. So even though Weill was a German composer, that's when he was living in Paris. And so he wrote a number of French language songs then. But, you know, Tiff, you're exactly right that it's on the precipice of the Broadway show tune. The final piece, or piece number 1, which was the latest, is by Francis Poulenc, one of the guardian angels of this show, and it's called Les Chemins de l'Amour, so the pathways of love, and it comes from the year 1940. So, you know, I think you were spot on when you said that you heard a little bit of Ravel in there. You know, there's even those little La Valse rhythms. Dun, da, dun,
Yep,
da.
that's what I was hearing.
And Tiffany, I think you had another interesting insight here, which is that in some ways with this repertoire, the directionality of the kind of modernism might go the other way. And in fact, you know, in some ways that Poulenc is the sweetest. I mean, it's a waltz. And there are parts of it I could have played for you that would be a little crunchier, but overall it is a very enriched harmonic language, but it's like, it's almost enriched in that Disney kind of a way, you know, where there's a lushness to it. So anyway, that is our game of classical chronology today. Ted, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for letting me play.
Oh, thanks so much. We hope you come back.
We would be lost without you, Ted. Thank you for this help.
Thank you.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to mention to our listeners that you too can come on the GabFest and participate in one of our Prelude segments. Just mention your love for the GabFest on social media or in an email to your classically inclined friends, tag or CC us so that we see your post, and you'll be entered for your chance to come on the show and participate in one of our Prelude games. It's a win-win. You get the fun of a musical listening challenge, and more people get to enjoy our wonderful show. Check the show notes for our contact info and social media links. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
In June of 2019, the billionaire investor and philanthropist Robert F. Smith garnered major headlines when, with no advance notice, he announced in a commencement speech at Morehouse College that he would be paying off the student loans of the school's entire graduating class. One of only a handful of people of color to chair a major private equity firm, Mr. Smith quickly became a national hero by taking up the cause of student debt. Fast forward to the fall of 2020, and Mr. Smith had another shock in store. He publicly admitted to having played a supporting role in what federal prosecutors called the largest tax evasion case in U.S. history. He acknowledged to the New York Times that he had willfully failed to report over $200 million in income. As a result of this, Smith has signed a non-prosecution agreement in which he has agreed to pay $139 million in back taxes and penalties, and abandon a $182 million tax refund that he had been seeking for charitable contributions. He also agreed to cooperate with a number of ongoing investigations, which we'll discuss in the segment. So, what does this have to do with classical music? Well, it just so happens that Robert F. Smith has been chairman of Carnegie Hall in New York City since 2016, taking on the role with promises to be a stabilizing presence at Carnegie and a strong interest in the hall's education efforts. Since the revelation, Carnegie Hall's board members are staunchly standing behind Mr. Smith. He is beloved, according to president of the Ford Foundation and Carnegie trustee Darren Walker. He said that the board would not be asking for Mr. Smith's resignation. Another board member added that the board was without exception 100% behind him. Most of their statements are something to the effect of, everyone makes mistakes, and he's been a great chair for the organization. So guys, interesting situation we have here, right? We have a person who, we're calling this interesting that we called it a scandal, but this is just the public knowledge of what happened. In fact, the statements, the terms of the settlement are settled as of 4 years ago, and that's the duration to which Robert Smith has been cooperating with this investigation into tax evasion. And so now that we're finding out this, it's kind of interesting to shed a light into what happens on boards of performing arts organizations. So let's talk a little bit about Carnegie Hall, and by extension, boards and or arts organizations that are associated with major halls or major funds that support us as artists.
Well, like you say, it's the public revelation of something that's a few years old now. So there's a lot of things to think about this. One is that, given the state of white-collar criminal investigations in this country, it's entirely likely that he could have just gotten away with this. And probably other people do stuff like this all the time and get away with it. And many of them probably sit on the boards of major institutions, arts funds and museums and symphonies and operas all across the country.
Well, yeah, maybe we should talk about how Carnegie Hall operates, right? So it's a major kind of presenting organization that can host orchestras, chamber music ensembles, soloists, and they have a season of those performances, and it's obviously an iconic place to perform. So it's a little bit different in the operations of, let's say, an orchestra where the only thing that the organization is presenting is the orchestra itself, right? And so just in terms of just understanding the scale of how big this operation is in terms of Carnegie Hall and the fact that it resides in New York. But my other thought was, does this affect how many people show up to Carnegie Hall to come to concerts? You know what I mean? Like, if someone that is a head of a corporation is caught doing something illegal, then maybe there might be some kind of activism that goes toward boycotting that certain brand. I just don't see anybody really, the consumer of this art, and they're going to Carnegie Hall for concerts. Do you guys see them actually saying well, this guy's a crook and he made, I love this. He made a $200 million mistake, by the way. Not everybody not everyone gets to make those mistakes. Is that going to affect the average concert goer to stop going to Carnegie Hall just because this guy got caught and still remains on the board? I just don't see it.
Well, I think you're nudging towards a particular feature of our landscape which makes it not as susceptible to things like consumer boycotts as the commercial like car industry, which is that we depend on philanthropists, not the everyday ticket buyer, to uphold the vast majority of our organizations. And so obviously, I mean, like, this is like way beyond obvious. I don't feel like I'm kind of shading anyone by saying the board likes Robert Smith because he has a lot of money and has given a lot of money to this organization. He is a major philanthropist. And by the way, that's not a slur. I mean, I know that we're in a moment right now where it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of examine how one comes about wealth and how one spends it. But him having money and donating it to arts organizations is not in and of itself indicative of a moral fiber that kind of cuts either way strongly. I mean, you can kind of make that cut either way, right? But the fact is, we depend on these people. So you're not going to have people boycott Carnegie Hall over this, I don't think. I hear what you're saying, Kensho.
Well, the other thing to think about with Carnegie Hall is, as Kensho said, it's a rental hall, basically. I mean, like, you can rent Carnegie Hall if you want to. And in fact, I have been part of concerts at Carnegie Hall where, like, when I was conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Youth Orchestra, we banded together with the Columbus, Ohio Youth Orchestra, and we rented out Carnegie Hall for a Saturday night. And actually, just a little aside here, I was very surprised when we were doing that to find out the rates. So to get a noonday Thursday slot at Carnegie Hall cost $47,000 for a concert, and you got like a little warm-up rehearsal right before that. A Saturday night show cost $51,000. And so I was like, a difference of $4,000 when we're talking about multiple tens of thousands of dollars. Of course we're playing on Saturday night. You kidding me? But anyway, that's just to say, like, who is the customer here? I mean, the customer for a lot of what Carnegie Hall does, it is like youth orchestras and church choirs and different community groups that band together to rent out the hall. And there's no way they're not taking their slots at Carnegie Hall to say, I performed at Carnegie Hall because of the chairman.
Well, and it's not just those orchestras. I mean, I know of professional orchestras, like major orchestras of cities that are obviously not as big as New York, pay Carnegie Hall to go and tour and perform in Carnegie Hall so that they can say that they've performed at Carnegie Hall. So, it's all across the board.
Right. And because Carnegie Hall is a finite resource, which is to say it is the one acoustically appropriate space in New York City to present a concert.
Shots fired.
Well, it's just because, they built Lincoln Center in the 1960s and they opened it up and it didn't sound any good. And they've, renovated it several times and they're trying to raise another hundreds of millions of dollars to renovate it again. And, they were going to tear down Carnegie Hall in the 1960s. But basically, I think it was Isaac Stern stood up for the rights of the hall to exist. And thank God he did, because truly, I mean, Avery Fisher, it has nothing on Carnegie Hall's acoustics.
You mean David Geffen?
Yes, excuse me, David Geffen Hall. That's right.
Another billionaire, whatever.
So let's be nice for a second and assume that the rest of the board members on Carnegie are not also taking part in major multi-billion-dollar tax scandals, okay? But I think even then, it's not that hard to see why they would continue to support him. Am I wrong? What do you guys think?
I think there's just so many other options for incredibly wealthy people to take their money and donate. When you have so many options, not just for the arts, but they're all these kind of socially minded, social construct minded, activist, nonprofit organizations that you can give to. I think that the pickings are kind of slim too in terms of finding someone that is willing to shell out loads of money to support an organization like Carnegie Hall, right? So I think that's another reason why the board is supporting him. And, they're quoted as saying that he's been so generous and that he's been such a great supporter of the arts. So that outweighs this tiny $200 million mistake, I guess.
I mean, it's worth noting he didn't make that $200 million mistake against them. He made it against the U.S. government. And so somehow I feel like it's not hard for people to see how cheating the U.S. government is not somehow it doesn't invoke the same morally reprehensible reaction that we might have, for example, if it came to light that he had done something more personal, let's say, like abuse or, any number of crimes that feel more personal to us as normal citizens for some reason.
Right. And like when you make those kind of comparisons, Tiffany, I mean, later on in the article that maybe we'll link in the show notes as well, the New York Times article, they kind of compare it to other members of boards of big arts organizations that have been caught with something or they've been linked to something else, right? So like the Sackler family and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they're linked to OxyContin. So they've actually lately, I don't know when exactly, but they've now said that they're not going to accept money from the Sackler family. There are some other examples that have been because I'm a Mets fan, I will say this, because Steve Cohen, who just recently bought the Mets, in 2013 pled guilty to insider trading violations and paid a record $1.8 billion with a B dollar penalty, and he's still on the board of the Museum of Modern Art at MoMA. Mm-hmm. And I know for sure as a Met fan, because our previous owner, no one really liked him. Everybody's so excited to have this guy, as the owner of the Mets now. Like, we're finally going to be good because we have this amazing owner. But, let's just forget about the fact that he paid $1.8 billion as a penalty. I think that people do overlook, there's definitely this attitude of like, getting out of, or like, any kind of shady dealings that make you a lot of money in a way. I think there is also this attitude, maybe it's an American attitude of like, this person knows so much about money and they can move it around. That's like a value. And maybe that's changing now in terms of how the wealth inequality discussion has ramped up in the last few years. But I feel like people really celebrate the fact that people can kind of cheat the government out of their money or make deals that can make them 10 times the amount that they're supposed to be making. I think that is kind of celebrated as smart rather than, quite shady.
I think it's also relevant to note that because the victim is the U.S. government, it's a little easier for a lot of people to look at the situation, and I suppose by people I mean folks on the board along with Robert, but also people who are of similar wealth, to look at it and be like, well, he got caught and he paid his dues. And the system worked in a sense. He got caught, he admitted wrongdoing, and then he settled. And therefore, it's not incumbent upon the rest of us to impose additional civil or social penalties beyond that which he's illegally obligated to pay. I read an article today that came out about should we just be getting rid of boards in general? And what is the way past having extreme wealth essentially govern the entire operation of arts organizations? How can we get past this? And I'm not sure that there is a good answer at all because, like I said at the top of the segment, philanthropy is what we depend on. I don't think that will change anytime soon. Well, we'll continue to evaluate the situation as it comes forward. Kensho, why don't you take us into our next segment?
For our second segment today, we are going to continue our rather sporadic movie club and review Louis van Beethoven, a new film that debuted on Amazon last month. Written and directed by Niki Stein, this German biopic drops in on Ludwig van Beethoven's life at 3 different ages, connecting them with various well-known works by the composer. Let's hear a clip from the film. This is a section in which older Beethoven, is at the very first reading of his Grosse Fuge, which is from his quartet Opus 131. And Beethoven, though he can't hear, shouts that it is too slow and bangs on the piano to demonstrate his tempo.
Spielt er denn da, mon Dieu? Er wird so langsam. Allegro, schnell. Nicht andante, fast laufen. Da-dam, ba-bam, 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 ba-bam. Da-dam, da-dam, da-da. Da-dam, da-dam, da-dam.
So we've all seen the film. Initial thoughts. What do you guys think?
Well, on just a basic thumbs up, thumbs down basis, I'm a thumbs up. I actually really enjoyed this movie. I can have qualms and quibbles and stuff, and nits to pick, but I quite liked it. What about you, Tiff?
I also basically enjoyed it. I mean, it did make me think a lot about the choices that they were making, because when you're talking about a biopic, you know, you have what I would consider a very American Hollywood approach to the possible arc of Beethoven's life, which is, we know that he went deaf. This is like wider knowledge. And so there's no end of possibilities that would start with the middle life, right in the middle of his heroic period, where he would start to go deaf and then be grappling with that as he's kind of continuing to compose, and then taking him all the way up. And I can like kind of see in my head the final scene where they're turning him around to see the applause at the premiere of his ninth. Like that's the Hollywood arc, right?
Which was in, if you've ever seen Immortal Beloved.
Exactly.
That's in there.
So they did not do that. Right. We drop in, we have kind of alternating perspectives, one at the beginning-ish of his life and one at the end of his life, which sort of are spliced together in ways that I think are supposed to make us think about the parallels at the beginning and end of his life. And that's it. In fact, the entirety, if you think about his opus numbers, the entirety of the film takes place outside of his working opus that we know of. It takes place before Opus 1 and after Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so that's an interesting choice of material to start with. And I did learn something. I was refreshed by what I found to be a more or less eschewing over-dramatization of most of the characters. Now, there was a little bit, I mean, you guys remember the portrayal of Mozart, right?
I'm sure we'll get into
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll definitely get to that.
Well, but, you know, Tiff, I think you bring up a really good point, which is that, like, I think a successful biopic has to be about something. Like, it has to use its subject as a representation of some larger theme. And of course, what we traditionally associate Beethoven with is this heroic theme, battling against his demons and his disabilities to overcome and, you know, write this amazing music when he couldn't hear anything. But this movie is really about the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and class.
Yeah, class mobility.
Yeah. So it was a different perspective for sure. Mainly concentrating on Beethoven's early life from, you know, it's all in Bonn except for this one episode in Vienna. So, you know, he left Bonn to go to Vienna when he was 21 in 1791. And so basically we're getting Beethoven from like age, I don't know, what do we say? It's 8 or
It's age 8, I think.
8 to 21. And then we have this late Beethoven as sort of a framing device.
Yeah, and I think this is what makes this successful. And again, like I haven't spoken up about how I rate this movie, but yeah, it's like thumbs up with a bunch of quibbles is how I would say it. And what makes it successful is that they center around the themes in a way, and then they cut from an early part of his life to a later or a mid part of his life with certain like thematic connections that kind of illustrate, you know, let's say, I think there's a scene where he sees his early piano teacher read the Declaration of Independence, you know, in front of the
No, it's just sort of the local magistrate.
The local magistrate or whatever. And then that kind of cements in our head like, oh, like that's where he got this, you know, idea of freedom and liberty. And then there's another scene where he's reading Schiller's poem that eventually becomes the lyrics to Ode to Joy. So these, you know, they link all these things really well, I think, throughout his life, that it kind of shows the start of that thought and then the completion of it later on, which I thought was really interesting. So what I was thinking of when I was thinking about biopics, right? So the most recent one, other than this one that I've seen, is Bohemian Rhapsody, which came out like a while ago, but it's like probably the last biopic that I've seen. Have you guys seen that?
No.
So one of the things that I think I enjoyed it because I didn't grow up listening to Queen or didn't go to at any of their live shows, obviously, and so to me, like as an entertainment value, I enjoyed it very much, and learning about the story of Freddie Mercury and all of this. But then when you get to someone like Beethoven, obviously none of us were there, but we feel like we were because of how close we are to the music and how we know some of the supporting characters in reading about Beethoven, knowing something about it. So were there moments where you kind of stood up in the movie and were like, well, that's not, like, that would never happen, or like, you know, like you would never, you know, because those are the things that I heard as complaints about Bohemian Rhapsody from people that were there. It's like, well, that totally didn't happen that way. You know what I mean? Did you get a little bit indignant at all while watching this?
Well, Kensho, my guess is that you're alluding to this chapter, which is a pretty big chapter in the movie, which is a historical fact that Beethoven went to Vienna before moving there permanently when he was a teenager. I think he was about 18 or 19 years old. He went there because his way had been paid by the elector in Bonn for him to go study with Mozart. And we learn from the film that Beethoven was obsessed with Mozart. He was playing in the court orchestra, playing viola, by the way, and he got to play all of these Mozart operas. He was playing the Entführung aus dem Serail, and he was playing Figaro and stuff like that. And so he was a real Mozart groupie. And so he got this opportunity to go to Vienna. He was there for 2 months. Now, the historical record is very sketchy. There's no real confirmed evidence that these two met. The fact that he was there for at least a month suggests, with this purpose of meeting Mozart, suggests that he probably did. But, Mozart was kind of a flighty guy. I think that the movie shows pretty accurately that Mozart was a hard person to, nail down. It's, hard to set an appointment with Mozart and have him show up. However, maybe we should listen to a clip of what the movie assumes happened between Beethoven and Mozart.
So this scene is purportedly at least Beethoven's first concert in Vienna, and that he's playing Mozart's 20th Piano Concerto in D minor, and Mozart is in the audience sitting toward the back, and just out of the cadenza, toward the end of the movement, Mozart interrupts the performance to heckle Beethoven from the crowd, saying that his playing, and this is where I started to be like, okay, heckling maybe, it's a very great comedic opportunity for the movie, right? So I accept that. But then to say that the playing is too legato, I would expect Mozart to come with a little bit more of a wittier barb than just you're playing too legato.
He says you're using too much pedal. It's
if he's going to trash talk like this is not how it's going to be done. I just believe it. And then, they get into this kind of jam sesh, face off.
There's this line where Beethoven retorts. He stands up to Mozart and he says, "Well, I'm playing exactly what the maestro wrote."
Right.
Or, what Herr Mozart wrote. And Mozart says, "Well, how about you play what Herr Mozart didn't write?" And then for some reason he understands that to mean, "Oh, well, you're going to, play a little theme for me to, improvise upon."
Right. But then Mozart does play a theme that he wrote.
And then Beethoven starts to improvise on it.
And then Mozart finds himself another, keyboard in the back of the room.
Right, he finds a harpsichord.
Suddenly appears. Yeah, a harpsichord appears in the back of the room, and he sits down and starts fugue battling Beethoven. And this is not something maybe if it's a rap battle, this could be believed, but a fugue? How does that work in terms of improvisation?
Right. A fugue is awfully hard to do this kind of, cutting contest improvisation thing. Although, but, this kind of stuff did happen in Vienna in this era. There were these improvisation contests between great composer pianists.
Yes, that for sure. But, this is where I just threw my hands up and I said, okay, fine. I yield. I will just enjoy the drama of this film and just ignore all of the red alarm bells that are going off in my head.
Bravo! Famos!
Na, übertreiben Sie doch nicht ein bisschen, Mozart? Außerdem hat der junge Mann Ihr Konzert ja noch gar nicht beendet.
Ja, wenn man kleinlich sein will, ein wenig zu viel Legato, Majestät.
Wie meinen?
Zu viel Pedal, zu wenig Akkuratesse.
Aber ich habe jede Note so gespielt, wie Maestro Mozart gesetzt hat.
Man kann auch was spielen, was der Maestro nicht gesetzt hat.
Wenn der Maestro mir ein Thema vorheben will.
Mag er darüber improvisieren?
von Ihnen hören.
But this is where also, like, I felt on the whole, the selection of music, and there clearly was somebody that was kind of overseeing the musical side of things to make it make sense. But there were certain moments where I was like, oh my goodness, this is so bad. Where there's just like a complete oversight. So usually, generally, and this is for our audience that, maybe sees movies where they are musicians and usually it's completely out of sync and you're just so easily like they're airbowing or whatever, and it's just really fake. For the most part, this was good. I think there are a few moments actually in that Grosse Fugue rehearsal scene. I think the playing is completely fake.
Yeah, that first violinist is pure airbowing. Very frustrating.
Yeah, but then like I was impressed at the earlier part of the movie where he's actually performing that Mozart piano concerto for the first time. The orchestra's really much in sync, and it was believable that he was playing.
Yeah, they're actually. I mean, I think they're actually playing, actual notes which correspond. And also, who I think did quite well is the child actor, the one who plays
the
young
kid.
Beethoven.
I'm almost positive he must have been playing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really impressed with that.
And he was good. He was a good little actor, too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed him.
Of the three Beethovens, I hated the middle Beethoven. So, I mean, I couldn't stand the middle Beethoven.
Really? Why?
The scenes in which he's playing, it's so, like, he's not at all a musician in terms of, like, he's trying to emulate, like, the facial expressions or the reactions or the movements that even the head makes. Because, it's like that classic, like, behind the piano shot where you see the person's face and none of the things, like the hands. Then that's when like, this person just, they may have tried some shots the other way and just didn't work.
Well, what did you think of the Mozart actor? Because that, for me, like, we imagine Tom Hulce in that role. Like, that, It's just, you can't imagine it. Like, that is Mozart to me. And this guy seemed a little old for Mozart, and I looked it up. He's like a few years too. He's like, in his early 40s, where Mozart died, like, he was 36 or something. I don't know. I mean, he was ostentatious. He was sort of Liberace-like, and he wore these bright colors. The wigs and the costumes and stuff were really good, I thought, in general.
Yeah.
But like you say, like, they must have had that in mind, right? The fact that he's following this iconic Mozart character that was so over the top in terms of its personality and its kind of brightness, that they had to maybe contrast that in a way.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It was something that I had to get past, and once I just it was like you with watching that scene, which I was just like, okay, this guy is Mozart now. We just gotta, like, deal with it. Okay, fine. Yeah.
Or that scene with, so that was the other, like, cool cameo was, like, Da Ponte there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was nice.
Like, playing pool with Mozart, and, like, they're talking about, like, him having no teeth and all this. Like, that was kind of cool, and that's what I was there for, was kind of, you always want to kind of put together the names that you see on your scores and your music, like, as, like, real life characters. And, like, that's the gift that you're given by watching this movie, is kind of seeing how these characters all interact. And whether it was real or not, I think you can enjoy some of that.
Do you think that somebody who was not already familiar with, let's say, any aspect of Beethoven other than the fact that he's that famous classical deaf composer would have gotten this movie?
I was thinking about that too. I was thinking, like, whom would I recommend this to? I would recommend it to the average GabFest listener, I would say. Mm-hmm. But your average Joe Schmagegglehead off the street, I don't know.
Or even the average, like, film buff, right? Because, like, so, the reason that the prototypical Beethoven story of, him going deaf and struggling with his inner demons is so obvious to us just as normal people is that there's a certain drama in it that lends itself to a film or some sort of dramatic storytelling. The selections that they made here, while thoughtful and kind of off the beaten path in terms of, showing people what Beethoven's life was about, do not necessarily lend themselves to this. I mean, to encapsulate what happens in the movie, I'm a little hard pressed. I mean, I'm thinking, okay, they're trying to show where Beethoven's humanistic ideals come from, and also this sort of lost opportunity in love. But neither one of those was, well, actually I appreciated this, but neither one of those things was really shoved in front of my face to a degree where I felt like that's what the movie was about. And so I think that that's what would present challenges for the average, even the average film viewer, in this movie, especially if they didn't know anything about what Beethoven is and does.
Right, and because there's so much cutting between the three timelines.
That was a problem for me, actually. I got confused.
I mean, there's the one lucky thing about Beethoven's life, his lifespan in that regards, is that because it does go across the French Revolution, you can sort of tell what the early scenes are and the late scenes are by whether people are wearing wigs. Because pre-revolution they did and post they didn't.
But otherwise, I mean, I certainly learned something. I kind of enjoyed, like you said, Kensho, like being put inside the environment that you can kind of imagine, and then also have some things to quibble on. That's a cool feeling. So a nicely historical window.
If you were to see another biopic of another composer, who would it be? Like, do you have requests?
You know who I was thinking actually while watching this movie? Haydn. I think that would be a fantastic... I mean, it would never get made, but I think that would be a fantastic biopic. What about you guys?
Paganini?
Oh, yeah. That actually could really, really work. I was thinking Tchaikovsky. All right. Well, listeners, I think it's overwhelming. Maybe not overwhelming, but definitely a three thumbs up from the Gabfest here for Louis van Beethoven. So let us know if you've seen it and what you think. That just about wraps up this segment, but before we move on, we wanted to let you all know about our next book club. It's coming back. This time, we'll be reading something much more manageable than Wagnerism, a slim treatise called The Classical Revolution, Thoughts on New Music in the 21st Century by the Dutch composer John BORSTLAP. We'll only be doing one segment on this book, which is scheduled for our episode on January 28th. So if you care to read along with us, you can find a link to buy your own copy of the book in our show notes. All right, well, let's move on to our third segment.
This past September, Mark Almond was appointed Associate Principal Horn of the San Francisco Symphony. He came to the position from the San Francisco Opera, where he had served as co-principal horn since 2016, and before that, he was third horn of the Philharmonia Orchestra of London. Pretty impressive career path, right? Well, sure, but that's only the half of it. In addition to his many musical accomplishments, Dr. Almond is also an experienced hospital physician and has a PhD in immunology and virology from Imperial College London. When the COVID-19 outbreak ended opportunities for musical performance, Mark reached out to the University of California, San Francisco's Rosenberg Lab for Molecular Pathogenesis to join their COVID-19 research team, and has been working on a cryo-electron microscopy model to study how various genes and therapies affect the passage of the virus through various cellular structures. Not surprisingly, Mark Almond has received quite a bit of press in the classical music world, appearing in profiles by the San Francisco Classical Voice and the San Francisco Chronicle, among others. And we are extremely pleased to have him with us today. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, Mark, I just read a bunch of words that I do not understand. So maybe you could start off by explaining it. What is it you're doing with your research with the virus?
So I was a pulmonologist in London for 10 years or so. And as part of my time doing that, I did a PhD in viruses and immunology. So my area of interest is quite topical now. I sort of wished I'd carried it on slightly, but it was looking at the effect of obesity on the immune response to viruses. So back in 2009 with the H1N1 swine flu outbreak, it was noted that people who were morbidly obese had worse outcomes. And what I wanted to look at as part of my PhD project was whether obesity is having an effect on the immune response rather than a mechanical effect on breathing. So I spent 3 years looking at that, working with various viruses. So when it came to the pandemic here, I had experience dealing with viruses, manipulating them, etc., and looking at the immune response. So now with coronavirus, what I'm doing is I'm infecting various cell types with the virus, and then I'm looking at how the virus passes through the cell, through the various organelles of the cell, and then seeing how various gene knockouts affect the passage of the virus through the cell. So I'm not looking at vaccines, I'm looking at the mechanism of how the virus works so we can potentially identify therapies.
Mark, it's funny. I'm a conductor, but a lot of people also like to bring up my biology background because I do have a biology degree from my undergrad. There's a funny article that was written about me that's kind of like from medicine to music, and they talk about how I've gone from medicine and swapped over to music, yet I haven't gone to medical school. So you put me to shame with your scientific accomplishments, but I'm curious just on a personal standpoint, like how did you, I wonder if you did balance or you focused on one or the other, or how did you juggle that? Because for me, there's definitely came a breaking point of keeping up with the research and the studies and the applications for medical school along with the practice, and you don't play a simple instrument to play either. So to balance horn on top of that is quite incredible for me.
You know, I started playing horn when I was 9 or 10 or something like that. I started getting good at it when I was 14. And then from 14 to 18, I was like, what do I want to do? What do I want to do here? Do I want to do music? Do I want to do medicine? You know, I really wanted to do music, but my parents were very much like, no, get a proper job, go and be a doctor. And I was like, okay. So I went to do medicine, and I went to Cambridge University, where the music there, the extracurricular music is phenomenal. But, what I didn't realize was that the Cambridge sort of medical system is a competitive system where you're competing against your peers. And so there's me like swanning off to like go and do rehearsals every night. Whereas my medical colleagues, they're just like working their asses off in medicine. And so I struggled a little bit. And then it only got worse because in my second year, I started working professionally in London. So I was then taking a lot of time off to go down to London to play and come back up. So I was taking a lot of time off. So the balance didn't really work that well for me. I still passed and still got decent grades, but they weren't the grades that I was used to getting. And I was like, why is that? I don't understand. But I then took a year off after Cambridge to go and work in London, trialing with various orchestras. And then I really enjoyed that. That was great. But again, there was this, I'll be kind. There was a slight pressure to go back to medical school and finish off the training. So I went back, and this time I was really committed because I realized the mistakes I'd made in my undergraduate degree, and I realized I need to put a bit more work in. So I did, and I worked really hard. And then in my first year at Oxford doing clinical medicine, but then music interrupted by offering me a job in the Philharmonia Orchestra. So I went and did that. And then I came back after a year of doing that. I could have stayed in that job. I really, really loved that job. It was a fabulous job. It was great. I was like 20 or something. I was just doing endless Mahler fives with Marzel, traveling around. It was a wonderful time, touring everywhere. It was great. But I'd done by that point, 4.5 years of a 6-year medical degree, and I felt I need to finish it. So I left, went back, and then I sort of really focused on medicine. I think when the orchestras do start, ramping up again, which hopefully they will do soon, the science is going to have to take a back seat again. But, it's been great to do what I've been doing. And hopefully the goal is to get some nice publications and some advancements of our knowledge.
So speaking of what you are doing now, you currently serve on a number of advisory boards pertaining directly to COVID with musical organizations. Is that right? Would you tell us a little bit about your work with those organizations and what your job on those boards entails?
Yeah, so I sit on a couple of the medical safety advisory boards for a couple of the orchestras in town over here in San Francisco. That basically involves reviewing the literature that's coming out, reviewing city guidance, reviewing proposals from the organizations about what's safe, what isn't safe, coming up with testing protocols.
And did these exist before COVID? Were there medical advisory panels for orchestras beforehand?
Not to my knowledge. From what I understand, all orchestras, opera companies, etc., have health and safety officers who, I have to say, respect to them. They didn't sign up for COVID and everything that entails. Hats off to these people because they're working so hard and they've had to get our knowledge. They just had to learn so much about virology and ventilation systems. But no, I think they had health and safety advisors, and I think most orchestras have a physician advising them. But with this pandemic, I think most orchestras have ramped it up and they've now got full teams of specialists. So I sit on one of those, a couple of those teams, and sort of we have meetings every Monday morning at the unmusician hour of 7 a.m. to discuss all things new in COVID-related activities.
And do you have a sense of, across the industry, what percentage of orchestras and opera companies and arts organizations have assembled these kinds of boards, and what sorts of, expertise are represented on them, and what kinds of expertise do you think should be represented on them?
I'm pretty sure all of the major orchestras have some sort of team. I'm not sure about all of the smaller orchestras, although I imagine they do have people advising them. As to what sort of expertise, the key thing is that it has to be a team. You have to have more than one person. Ideally, you need to have an epidemiologist on there. You need to have an infectious disease person on there. You need to have someone with an occupational medicine background. And ideally, you need someone who knows about aerosol transmission and ventilation and stuff. So actually to put a team like that together is very hard. I think any physician has the capability to analyze the data, but you need the consultation of a group. You need a group discussion to sort of make things safe. But I've reviewed a lot of the guidelines that are out there, and there are a lot of very sensible things being said.
So I've done a few kind of COVID era concerts in various cities across the US. And one of the things that really strikes me every time is that the rules are very different, depending on where you are. And obviously those rules are put in place to, maximize the safety of the musicians and those that are on the stage. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a balance, isn't it, in terms of min-maxing? I've known for artistic reasons a certain shield has to be moved a certain way because it's affecting the players' sense of their sound, especially for brass players. The amount of the vibrations coming back at them is quite disturbing, as I'm sure you've experienced as well. So you spoke about this team that is the advisory board, and also I'm sure there's management and musicians involved in all of this. And so could you talk about kind of how those decisions are made and what who should be responsible for ensuring the safety of the musicians or people on stage?
Well, I think this is a two-sided thing. So musicians have an obligation to look after the safety of their audiences, and orchestra managements and agents of musicians have a moral obligation to look after their musicians, and they shouldn't put them in a position where they feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So just going back to the musicians looking after their audiences, that seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But I listened to a conference call recently of a national organization of physicians regarding the performing arts. And one of their headline people that started this whole session was a famous country western artist. So famous, I'm British, so I have no idea who it actually is. But
we're American, we probably wouldn't know either.
Yeah, but this person spoke, and he was an elderly person, and he was talking quite rightly so about how hard the pandemic has hit his band, and how tricky it is. But he was saying that he was on tour. I was like, wow, that's fantastic. And he was like, well, it's fabulous to get the band back together, and obviously you appreciate that. It'd be great to play with your colleagues. But then he was saying that he's performing in venues where some venues insist on strict social distancing and masks, and some venues don't. And you got 200 people in a room, and they're playing, and they were saying like, oh yeah, we're about 8-10 feet away from the front row of the audience. We're not wearing masks, we're the band and stuff. And I'm just like, had my head in my hands, like screaming, like, what on earth? I appreciate and I understand that it's a nightmare for musicians at the moment. It's so hard and it's tragic. I see my colleagues, who I've been playing with over here for the past 4 or so years, selling their beloved instruments because they have to, because of financial hardship. And that's heartbreaking. But, when you hear about bands going on tour, playing in venues where there isn't social distancing, isn't masks, that's just irresponsible and wrong. No matter how much money you lose because of that, you can't do that. So that's the moral obligation of the performer. Then coming to the moral obligation of the orchestra to the musicians, on the whole, and with the organizations I've been dealing with, yes, safety is absolutely paramount and people are not taking any risks. And that's how it should be. However, you see it a lot on social media, especially around Christmas time, the holidays, because people are putting out little carol concerts and little groups. And you see you see brass quintets playing together in a room without bell covers. And, you might know a couple of them, and you get in touch with them and say, oh, were you tested? And they're like, no. And you're like, okay. And you weren't socially distanced, because I can tell that from the video. And you're like, why were you ever put in that position? That's not right. That's not right. And I've seen full orchestra concerts where I know the people weren't tested, and I know there isn't appropriate separation. And, it's difficult for me because, I'm a musician. I want to come back and play. For God's sake, I won a job back in February, and I've not really done a full orchestra concert with my new employees, my new employers. So I'm desperate to get back playing, but it's not right. And it's so dangerous because, you saw from these, from the choir rehearsals in Washington back in March.
Just north of where I am, Skagit Valley.
Skagit, yeah. So 61 people attended a 2.5-hour rehearsal. And from that, 53 people got the virus. 3 people ended up in hospital and 2 people died. Yeah. Where are we now? What was it? January the 3rd. Back in March, or April, I should say, really, we were way more shut down than we are now. And yet the pandemic is a lot worse right now. And yet we're more open. So, we know a lot more about the virus, but still there's this, it's not right at the moment. Yesterday, what was it? I think like 2,500 people died in this country. And we're so close to the vaccine. The vaccine is out, it's being rolled out. So we don't have to hold on long, but I think we do need to wait a little while. My estimate of when things are back to air quotes normal has changed. I was, when this thing first started, I was like, oh, September would be okay. And then I'm like, oh, January. Yeah, no. Now I'm thinking, I was thinking June, but I think with the vaccine rollout and stuff, I think we're looking September.
I appreciate, Mark, that you took a look at some of the literature on choirs, because I'm an orchestral conductor, but I'm also a choir director. And I guess the one question I have for you is, let's say that, we, quote unquote, are back up and running in September of this year. Is there any reason to believe that in addition to orchestras being back up and running, choirs wouldn't also be able to be back up and running? I mean, is there any distinction? Because, I mean, I know that it's a different thing when we're talking about 60 people emitting huge amounts of aerosol together in a room, but, that's a case of a wind section or whatever. But so I just wonder if you have any read on that.
I think the problem is that the choirs don't have the flexibility that orchestras have in terms of everyone in a choir is an aerosol generator, whereas obviously you have a string section, and a percussion section that don't generate the aerosols. So I think the degree to which choirs can go back, and orchestras also with their full wind section, it all depends on how well behaved we are as a country and how the community incidence goes down. You saw what happened in Europe with Berlin and the Concerto and stuff, putting concerts on, and in other places they had full concerts. In Paris, I think they had full audiences as well. But that's because community instance went down. Everything still needs to be taken in context. Wow. Sorry, that's depressing.
No, it's good. And honestly, I really appreciate you coming on the show and giving us such a well-rounded analysis of this situation, touching on ethics and science and music and art. And, we would love to have you back on the show in the future, sort of in a post-vaccine world to see where we're at, to catch up and let's see if our prediction of September 2021 is accurate after all. But, before we let you go, Mark, would you be willing to stick around and recommend something for our classical mixtape?
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Mark, what do you have for us this week?
So I was thinking British music, and I was thinking a bit of William Walton. There's a fantastic CD of Belshazzar's Feast with Richard Hickox, who's sadly passed away now, conducting the LSO. And that's tied on the same CD to some more Walton. So the Suite from Henry V and Spitfire, Prelude and Fugue, Orb and Scepter, Crown Imperial. It's an absolutely fabulous CD. Not only is it great music, but the performance is fantastic. And being a horn player, the horn playing's amazing.
Thanks so much, Mark. Let's go to Kensho next.
So as the year has turned over into 2021, Happy New Year, everybody. There's also a list of classical compositions that are now public domain. So in celebration of this, the three of us have picked pieces that are written in 1925. And I'm leading off here, and I'm kind of going down the same route that Mark went, in that I'm picking also a British composer, Vaughan-Williams' Flos Campi, which is a piece written for solo viola, orchestra, and a wordless choir. Well, I'm actually really surprised that you didn't pick this piece, because it has viola solo, a choir, and orchestra. I just felt like this was just prime Will White classical mixtape.
My impression of this piece was I must have listened to it when I was like 19 years old and thought it was boring. And I think that probably happens to a lot of people, because it is a very, it's a very ethereal kind of piece with this wordless choir and these like pentatonic Vaughan-Williams melodies and harmonies and stuff. But, as we were going through the list of pieces that, are public domain, which means that now like orchestras and choirs and stuff can perform them royalty free. I was listening to Flos Campi again a couple times over the past 2 days, and I love it. I think it's an amazing piece of music.
All right. Will, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I chose a piece that I had never heard of before. It's a piece by Jean Sibelius, and I believe that making his classical mixtape debut, which is a bit of a shocker to me, because I don't know how you guys feel about Sibelius, but he's one of my very favorite composers. But this is a piece I had never heard of before. It's a short orchestral work, and Sibelius has so many of these. There was about a year or two ago, I just started going down a rabbit hole of these. They're not even what you would call tone poems. They're like character pieces for orchestra. Valse Triste, I suppose, might fall into this category, Pan and Echo. This one is called Morceau romantique sur un motif de monsieur Jakob de Julin. So that's the romantic piece on a motif by Mr. Jakob de Julin, I guess is how you would say his name. It's based on a theme written by a prominent Swedish industrialist. And this was all part of a charity benefit. And Sibelius, wrote this and conducted it in 1925 and sold off the manuscript, and it raised a lot of money for charity.
That's cool. It's like Sibelius meets Tchaikovsky ballet.
Yeah, and I think that maybe it's the use of the harp that suggests that balletic quality to it.
Well, there's also and the string texture underpinning the harp and the waltz kind of feel. That's all Tchaikovsky. Well, for my section of the mixtape, everyone this year, in terms of looking at works that enter the public domain, is going to be talking about Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. But I think that I'm bringing today the Piano Concerto in F, which is its lesser loved brother. And I think it's probably in most ways the stronger composition of the two. I'm really a strong proponent of this piece, and I'm so excited now that I get to look at a version of this, hopefully in the public domain, that is not chicken scratch and that you can actually perform without paying up the nose for it. So, and also the recording that I'm recommending today is Earl Wild with Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. And the piano playing is fantastic, obviously, but the real reason that I want to recommend this recording is because of the trumpet solo in the beginning of the second movement, which is just the sultriest, most it's sultriest in the most tasteful of ways, and it's hard to do really well, and this recording does that for me. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.